Hey there, folks. This is Misadventure here today with the 13th developer diary for my Imperator Rome overhaul mod project, Hegemony. I am really excited to begin this developer diary with a major announcement. The release date for the alpha version of Hegemony is going to be August 1st, 2024. That's 8/1/2024. That is the hard and fast release date of the alpha version of the mod. Now, to set expectations about what that means exactly, I consider the alpha version of this mod that will be going public on August 1st to be the core gameplay experience, the finished Aegean Theater map with all of the regions and provinces laid out, all of the tags in more or less their final locations with their more or less final borders, all of the core mechanics for the mod, and keep in mind that almost every single mechanic, or actually probably every single mechanic from the base game, all of the various systems, have been rebalanced or overhauled completely. So it's a massive, massive new gameplay experience compared to vanilla Imperator Rome. All of that will be done and playable, of course, subject to many more tweaks and balance changes, which is the whole point of an alpha and a beta, to get playtesting and feedback, and for me to be able to do a lot of playtesting as well. But the core gameplay experience with the new and updated pop system, the building system, and everything else will be in place for the alpha release. Again, that is August 1st, 2024. What will probably not be in the alpha release is a lot of the more specialized and complicated stuff, which is largely going to revolve around some of the more unique playable nations. For example, the complicated long wall mechanic or the Lacedaemonian Helot mechanics will probably not be done in time for the alpha release, and many other nation-specific, kind of city-state-specific mechanics, like many of the unique missions and whatnot, will probably not be in place for the alpha release. Those are going to be more things that I work on in the beta. They will be in place along with all the other things that I consider central features of the mod in time for once we do the alpha release and then later a beta release. The full final version release, the 1.0 version release, which will be at some point in the future after August 1st, probably not very soon after, but that will be when the mod is officially done with its actual development, and I will of course make plenty of announcements ahead of the beta release, post-alpha release, and then the final release, post-beta release. And then after the final release, I will still make new updates, which add more content, increase the number of nations with unique missions, and so on and so forth. Unlike with vanilla Imperator Rome, where a lot of the big overhaul mods are really about adding more missions to nations that already have a lot of unique missions, here, because I basically started from scratch, I have to make everything from the beginning, so it's going to take a long time to have the level of unique and interesting nations having fully developed sets of missions and mission trees comparable and competitive with the scope of and scale of something like Invictus or Terra Indomita, or even to some extent Vanilla Bronze Age, as those mods have existed for many years and are also the product of a team of people working, whereas with this project it is basically just me. But that's not a complaint, rather I see it as a challenge to rise to the occasion for. And I know that the community of people who have been very patiently waiting for the release of this mod are very understanding of the limitations that I've got as someone who works full-time and only does this project as a little side hobby. But I know a lot of people are really, really excited to play Hegemony, even a very basic version of it that doesn't have a lot of the bells and whistles that a lot of people are excited to see. And I think that the core gameplay experience, which I hope is going to be really fun and engaging as just a grand strategy experience, even without some of the unique mechanics, that's what I'm hoping to provide with the alpha version ultimately. So very, very excited to release the alpha, again, the Steam Workshop on August 1st, 2024. That's a couple of months away. It's a little, let's see here. Yeah, because today is May 12th, and so that's the day that this video is going to be released. So it's basically, let's see, June, July. It's basically a little over 2.5 months away from when this video is going live, so you can look forward to that, and of course I will continue to make developer diaries up through the, or actually for the entire life of this mod, as I'll still probably keep the same developer diary format, to share what I'm working on even post-release with my update content and whatnot. So either way, that is the big announcement I wanted to start this video with, announcing essentially for the first time a release date for the mod, of course, an alpha version, so just wanted to set everyone's expectations in the right way. Please just be aware that I'm not releasing the entire mod with everything all at once on August 1st. I could quit my job and just work on this mod day and night and still not be done in time for that if I was releasing the entire mod with everything that I want to be in the ultimate final version. But I think that giving myself a release date for the alpha does help motivate me to finish off the little bit of work remaining, a little bit in the context of compared to all of the work I've done in the last couple of months. Speaking of which, there's quite a bit of new stuff to show you all in the actual campaign maps. Let's go ahead and load in here. And in this, the remainder of the video, I wanted to show you all a new area of the map that I've worked on, which if you've been following on the Discord, you will have been able to see the progress of, as well as one other system that I have at least the alpha version done for at this point, essentially. What am I trying to say? It's been a long day, I'm very tired. The kind of alpha level has been done of this system, which is the building system. So, having stumbled my way through saying that, let's go ahead and take a look at northern Greece. Now, if you've been following on the Discord, you will have seen the many Discord updates I made as I worked on this giant area, this set of regions. This is an area that's essentially the same size as the Peloponnese and the Attican Peninsula. It's actually probably a bit bigger. Fortunately, this area, well, I say fortunately, it's essentially the quintessential double-edged sword. We have very little information about what was going on over here during the classical period. Once we're looking at the kind of Hellenistic period or kind of the Roman period, we have a lot more information because the Macedonians and then later the Romans, of course, conquered this area, and we know a lot about Epiros because, of course, the Epirotes wrote down their own histories. But before all of that, right, back in 431 BCE, what was going on over here, people can only speculate. And we have some information, but a lot of what I have done to create this area to be as historically accurate as possible is largely do a little bit of guesswork and sort of guesstimate where cities may have been. A lot of these ancient cities that we have records of, we don't know exactly where they were, unlike some of the cities in the south that actually continued on to be major cities later in history, and their locations are very well known. Up here, many of the big cities at the time, it's basically just a guessing game where they were. So let me hop in here to some random nation, and I'll show you all the region situation up here in the north. This is basically what I sort of think of as the northern Greek area, or kind of the tribal Greek area. This is an area of Greece where most of the nations here are actually tribes, not democracies or monarchies. And there are a couple of nations around here that do buck that trend. Obviously, Macedon and the colonial states along the coastline over here are not exactly following that rule. And of course, we've got Corcyra, who I've added a number of historical colonies for as well along the coastline here. The locations of Oikos, Panoramos, and Kestria over here. And in terms of the regions, here's the region view. Again, I've not worked on coloring in the Chalkidike or the Thessaly regions and flags yet, but I have done that for these areas here. So, of course, we've got the Corcyra region over on its island. And then on the mainland, heading from the kind of classical Greek edges, from the point of view of the classical Greeks, we've got the small region of Dolopia, which is mostly comprised of the city-states of Amphilochia and Astakos, and then we've got the tribe of the Dolopes up here in the mountains. One design thing I'm going for with the Greek tribes is that they have no borders on their flags the way that the sort of southern Greek city-states or colony states have, just to distinguish the cultural differences. But ultimately, these are still Greeks, and I think that in a mod that is almost entirely about a period of Greek history, and many parts of this mod are aesthetically designed to be from the point of view of the Greeks, essentially, who are the center of the Peloponnesian conflict. With that all noted, in a mod like this, I think it's important to include a lot of attention and love to these northern areas, even though at the time, the southern Greeks may not have seen these areas as being Greek, or the people who lived there as being Greek. in terms of cultural history and archaeology, there's very little that distinguishes the sort of the northern barbarian Greeks from the southern Greeks beyond what kinds of governments they had and what we know about them. And so the level of organization or civilization that was in the northern areas is really up in the air. But I think it is fair to say that during this period, these were more so decentralized tribes compared to the south. Where keep in mind, when you imagine, a classical Greek civilization or a classical Greek city, it was not, white marble pillars everywhere and everyone was in togas and, it was all like super. It was not all kind of cosmopolitan like that. Obviously, that was the case in a few specific areas, but those places of luxury were the extreme exception in the most rich city-states. The vast majority of Greeks across the entire Greek subcontinent all basically lived in the same tribal squalor as everyone else did, right? And you have this tiny minority of people who lived in slightly cleaner environments, but even then it was not exactly quite as pristine as it sort of seems in the way people remember it. Essentially the idea of there's the southern Greeks who are super civilized and they're all really clean, and then the northern Greeks are these barbarians. That's like a southern Greek, propaganda racism idea, from the time, right? That's the way Thucydides thought about the northern Greeks. But in terms of the actual real history, the overwhelming number of people who lived in all parts of this entire area all lived basically the same experience. It's just the governments were a bit different. And the northern governments were probably less organized just as a matter of circumstance. And the Dolopes tribe up here in the mountains, to just kind of come back over from my little spiel about that to the actual thing we're looking at, this is a storied tribe. It has a very, very long history. Actually, a different kind of ethnic group or culture group from the nearby Epirotes, we'll talk about in a minute. So the Dolopes will have some unique content, to be sure, to represent their interesting history as one of the oldest Greek tribes, continuous Greek tribes over in their mountains. In fact, actually, the northern Greeks represent a kind of origin point for much of Greek culture, as the kind of proto-Greek culture, actually from the Bronze Age period, which the Bronze Age mod to some extent simulates, kind of migrated south from the north, displacing the Aegean peoples and pushing them out to the islands. And so some of these tribes actually have quite old histories. And the distinction of these are Greeks and these are not Greeks is not really true. And I think that even though that's a viewpoint ultimately that the southern Greeks may have had in many cases, again, the idea of a barbarian versus a non-barbarian is very subjective and very, within the eye of the beholder. And so ultimately in this mod, which is all about representing this moment of very complicated Greek culture, I think it's only appropriate to give the northern Greeks just as much attention and effort at historical accuracy as I give the southern Greeks, even if there's a lot less information known about them, so I have to make some educated guesses here and there. Moving along, we enter into the Thesprotis region, which is the southernmost and smallest of the Epirote regions. Thesprotis is, in many ways, under the control, or at least under the influence of the local Greek colony of Ambracia, who is a steadfast Peloponnesian ally and someone who is going to be quite a rival to Corcyra. They're actually, I believe, a Corcyran colony. They may have been another Corinthian colony, but either way, Ambracia does not like Corcyra and is very, very loyal to their overlord Corinthos, or their kind of historic overlord Corinthos. Sharing the region with them is a number of tribes here. Many of the Epirote tribes outside of Melosia, which we'll get to, are splintered into little tribal units that are centered around a major city. I haven't set up the cities yet, but if you look up a map of classical Epiros and look for all the city names, you'll see some similarities to the way these tribes are named, and each of them does have a city location that is their center. And then the most powerful Epirote tribe of the Thesprotians, because the Epirotes are split into several different cultural groups, not really cultural groups, they're all going to be in one Epirote cultural group, but into several different cultures that are, unlike in the rest of the mod, region-specific. Elsewhere in the mod, most regions have a culture group, and then within each region, each city-state has its own unique culture, just to really, because the mod is, again, focused on zooming in really closely. With the Epirotes, there's a difference because we know less about their cultural differences, and so The most we know is that during this time there were basically three Epirot tribes: the Molossians, the Thesprotians, and the Chaonians. And in order to try to represent this, I've got the three core Epirot regions: Thesprotis, Chaonia, and Molossia. And there's one Epirot culture group, and then everyone in these regions that is not a Greek colonist is in the Epirot culture group, and then we got these three Epirot cultures, each living in one of the regions. And then they're split into different communities based on the city. So that's the basic way that I've approached it. Again, I didn't do it like this with Molossia, who actually start as one tribal kingdom in full control of the region. I'll talk about them in a moment. But the most powerful Epirot tribe of the Thesprotian region is the Dodones, who of course are in charge of Dodona, a very important city to Epiros and actually to the entire Greek world, one of the holiest sites of the Greek faith alongside places like Delphi. And this is definitely quite a powerful little tribe over here. Now, heading northward along the coastline, of course, Corcyra looms in the nearby distance, but we got the Chaonia coastal region, which is split between the Amantes tribe, the Buotrotes tribe, and the Phonikes tribe, the most powerful in the area, with their capital at Phonike. Then we've got the city-state colony of Aulon, who is, I believe, a Corcyra colony. I need to check my Discord to read my own history that I wrote when I was doing the research a little while ago, but I think they're actually a Corinthian colony, so they're sort of on the same level of Corcyra. Don't remember for sure. Actually, no, I'm wrong about that. Aulon, the reason why I'm getting confused is that Aulon was actually a colony of, what was it? I think it was Epidomnos. No, I think it was Apollonia, north of here. They're not on the map. The map doesn't go far north enough to include the area that Apollonia would be in. I think they're an Apollonian colony, and Apollonia themselves were a Corcyran colony or a Corinthian colony. But I think it's funnier if Apollonia was a Corcyran colony, because that means that Aulon, who is, I believe, neutral in the war at the start, is basically a grandson level descendant of Corcyra, let alone Corcyra's own originator, Corinthos. And in the Discord, I've mentioned a few times something I've learned about the Peloponnesian period from my research is that nothing will ever be as complicated as the Corinthian colonial environment. There's so many different layers of colonies making other colonies all over the entire Mediterranean and Ionian seas. Corinthos, its foremost colony was Corcyra, and they were so powerful that they basically had their own colonial empire completely separately from their own mother city of Corinthos. It's just very complicated, and all these different nations all have different relationships with each other. Many of them don't like each other. Corinthos and Corcyra are bitter rivals despite their long relationship with each other, and their rivalry actually is one of the main causes of the Peloponnesian War, at least according to Thucydides, who in fairness was Athenian and was, in all honesty, probably a little biased, even though many people do laud him, retroactively, because he's been dead for a long time, obviously, because he was alive during the period, but many people do laud Thucydides for being actually a pretty neutral source on the matter. He had his problems with Athenae, to be sure, but he was ultimately an Athenian and did have a bias against Corinthos, a longtime Athenian rival. So either way, the Corinthian-Corcyran rivalry is one of those things in the game that, despite many alt history paths being available with much of the extra content I'll be adding to the game over time, that's something that's going to be pretty hard for the AI to break away from. So either way, having gone off on a tangent about that, let's talk about Molossia. Molossia is the most powerful of the Epirot tribes. It's actually not even a full normal tribe, but rather a new government form I'll be creating for the mod called a tribal kingdom. Basically a middle step between a settled tribe and a regular monarchy, with a mixture of sort of modifiers and mechanics from both. And it's not the only tribal kingdom on the map. Some of the other major tribes are going to be tribal kingdoms. Molossia during this period was considered the most organized and the most powerful of the Epirot tribes. And so unlike the other regions where the culture is split into kind of city-states, sort of city-state tribes, Molossia starts off as a proper, powerful nation with the entirety of its region under its control. And it has a cool flag, which is not a gameplay thing, but I like the way the flag looks. Molossia is, of course, associated with the Molossian hounds, so I thought a dog-themed flag was appropriate. And putting that aside, Molosia is also the Molosians are also the most powerful of the cultures of the Epirotes, and it was the Molosian culture that eventually unified Epiros together and created the Epirote state, which happened after the period that this mod is set. But of course, during this a campaign in this mod, playing as Molosia or any of the Epirotes, you can unify the Epirote regions together and form the Epirote state a little ahead of schedule and join in with the Peloponnesian fun as Epiros, which could be pretty fun. Of course, if you want to do it historically, although still ahead of schedule, playing as Molosia is probably the most historical way of doing that, and probably also the easiest way of doing that. Ultimately, Molosia does see itself as a bit of a natural hegemon over the Epirotes, and so their main goal is going to be to kick the southern Greeks and their colonies out of Epiros altogether, and ensure that the northern Greeks have got them to kind of lead the charge, and maybe join in the Peloponnesian War, perhaps on the side of the Peloponnesians, because Corcyra, of course, is Delian, or not really picking a side, but just fighting everybody and trying to engage in a little bit of Pyrrhus-style conquest a little ahead of schedule. But we shall see what people can come up with that. Now, heading further inland, we've got the slightly Epirote area of Paraoea. Now, this is peopled by what are going to be Epirote tribes of Molosian culture, which is historically accurate to the period, but this is not an area considered historically part of Epiros, at least not really. The exact borders of Epiros during this period are very hard to figure out, but this is kind of a semi-Epirote area. I don't know if I'm going to include this area as the territory you have to control to form Epiros. I'm still on the fence about that, but at least if you want to play as a Epirote tribe in kind of an odd location, you can do it up here in this region with one of these three tribes. Heading up here, we've got three more regions that are filled with non-Epirote northern Greek tribes. We've got Elmiotis, which is peopled by, wouldn't you guess it, the Elmiotes. This is a very nice valley area around the river here, and this is quite a lush area with another little tribal kingdom, one that historically, similarly actually with the Lynkestai up here in the Lynkos region. These were historical targets of Macedon after this period, during especially the reign of Philip II, who conquered much of what will become known later as kind of Upper Macedon, or Outer Macedon, kind of these Macedonian borderlands. But at this time, these are local tribes who, especially when working together, can hold Macedon back. Macedon does have a lot of other things to worry about. Keep in mind that Macedon is a full Peloponnesian League member and is quite involved in the war, and has a lot of concerns about the Thracians over in the east. So their western borders, which are, largely pretty quiet, are not going to likely be their focus. So playing as the Elmiotis or the very defensively located Lynkestai give you a lot of options for focusing on consolidating power in the tribal north, with Macedon largely being uninvolved. But of course, taking on Macedon is going to be a pretty big challenge for one of these nations. Even harder for the very small nations up here in the Orestis region, and these are basically non-Epirote northern Greeks living up here in the very furthest corners away from the civilizational areas of the south, with much more organized and centralized nations. These are very decentralized tribal areas. And one particularly interesting one is the nation of Dasaretii, or the Dasaretii, which is actually going to be an Illyrian tribe, which is historically accurate to the way the map is shaped and the classical period. And they're going to have their own special mechanics about being a essentially foreign invader sliding into this map from off-map Illyria, and having a completely different culture group and some pretty different mechanics as a classical age Illyrian tribe, kind of just existing here on the Hegemony map. So lots of really cool kind of campaign scenarios and different things you can play up here in the northern areas. Even though all the action is centered in the south, I wanted to make sure that the north got just as much attention and love, and I'm really excited to see what kinds of cool campaign ideas people can go for. I'm just really excited to watch people play Hegemony, honestly, on YouTube. I think it's going to be really cool. I'm going to play Hegemony as well. Probably when the alpha is released, I'm going to do I'm going to try doing a kind of a playtest campaign, just to sort of see if my own balancing decisions are fun for me, which is going to be something I'll probably take into account when I make balancing changes. I mean, who's going to stop me, right? It's my mod. But anyways, that is the new territory that I've added since the previous developer diary. And with that noted, let's go ahead and take a look at the other thing I wanted to show off in this dev diary, which is the building system. I have now made all of the city buildings and all of the tribe buildings, and this is all very much work in progress. This is getting into really nitty-gritty modifier stuff. But to basically thoroughly explain how the buildings work, as it's a little complicated to do just kind of conceptually, I first need to go over how settlement and city modifiers are balanced, and then remind everyone with a little showcase of the pop balancing. Because keep in mind that because I changed the way all of the pops are balanced, this then has a knock-on effect, because vanilla Imperator Rome is completely centered around the way pops give resources and affect things. Almost all of their modifiers are, in my opinion, supportive of the pop system or sort of reactive to the pop system. The general design philosophy I have for how Hegemony is going to be balanced is to basically decentralize the game's entire structure from the kind of pop system where the pops are the center of a wheel and all the other systems are spokes on the wheel that connect to the pop system. Instead, I want to have a network of systems that all interconnect with each other. Instead of a wheel, more of a series of support systems that hold each other together and together are cohesive, not just in relation to one specific system. And so with that in mind, let me first remind everyone, or I guess I haven't really shown this before, but let me first show off, I suppose, how settlements and cities are balanced in terms of ratios and whatnot. So first of all, let me talk about metropolises. There's not that many of them, but just to show really quick an example here with Atenai, which does start as a metropolis, 100 pop capacity by default, 19 extra city building slots on top of the one that you get by default, plus all the ones from population. All metropolises and cities in Hegemony have one fort level by default. I made a very big change to the way the fort meta will work, so you will not need to be building forts in all of the cities anymore. The cities automatically have fort level, and it does work correctly. Keep in mind that Hegemony, because I'm playing as Hegemony right now, does have a fort built, but if I destroy it, you can see that the fort icon does remain. This is still a fortified tile with just one fort level now. But anyways, going back over here, and then ignore the migration attraction thing. Actually, no, don't ignore that. That is the correct amount. 2 migration attraction, 5,000 provincial food capacity for it being a metropolis, 4 local-based trade routes, and then in terms of desired ratio, I have not finished localizing all of the different pop modifiers because there's a bunch per pop, but the Adastoy, or the nobles, it's 5% for metropolises. The polites, or the citizens, are 25%. And then the freemen, or actually the, let me see if I can say the name correctly, the metoikos, which again, remember, means kind of foreign-born populations, is 20%. Tribesmen, or the banausoi, which means kind of craftsmen or workers, is 30%, and then the slave desired ratio is, or the dwalos is, it's 20%. Is that? Did I adjust that yet? No, that's correct. Okay, yeah. So that is the way that metropolises are balanced. They have a big focus on citizens and nobles, but they do also have quite a few of the other classes as well. Cities are pretty similar. They're scaled down a little bit. Only 50 pop capacity, which is honestly quite a bit. 9 city building slots by default, the 1 fort level. 2 base trade routes instead of 4. They don't have any migration attraction bonus. 1k provincial food capacity, and I believe actually just completely the same desired ratios for everything there. And then settlements are just scaled down even further. 25 pop capacity, 1 city building slot, and I'm planning to just have the same kind of meta as vanilla, where settlements are going to have just 1 building slot under normal circumstances, 100 food capacity by default, which is actually pretty low. And then the desired ratio here is even more scaled back. There's no noble desired ratio at all, so there's 0% noble desired ratio in settlements under normal circumstances, 10% citizen desired ratio or politis desired ratio, only 5% for the foreigners, and then 55% for slaves and 30% for the craftsmen. So you can sort of see how settlements are going to be a bit better suited for those sort of lower class populations to be present there. Right, so having said all that, let's take a look at the building situation. Now, the most important thing that I've done in terms of the way I've rebalanced buildings... Actually, no, hold on. Before I talk about buildings, let me talk about pops, because I can't explain the way the buildings are going to work without talking about the pops and the way I've rebalanced them. So, it's a little hard to really get across the exact numbers because the pops are always going to be displayed in their modified form. But essentially, in terms of what the pops do, and this is a refresher because I've talked about this on a previous developer diary, the Adastoi pops, the noble pops, they give base tax, they give a base tax modifier, they give local manpower, research points, and they give monthly splendor, which remember in this mod is the replacement I have for civilization level. Splendor gives a very strong tax and commerce bonus per... It's the same amount as the current Splendor. So Splendor is very, very strong. Once you have a full Splendor, 100 Splendor on a tile is 100% local tax and province commerce, which is just really, really strong. And then Polites also give monthly Splendor and base tax, local manpower, research points, and province commerce percent as well. And these may seem like a little strange, like what's going on here. I'll talk about the thinking behind how all these things are balanced in a moment. The Metoikos give base tax, local manpower, research points, not a commerce modifier, but actual commerce value, like the commerce money you would get from trading a resource in vanilla, and then a migration attraction as well. And all of these are all modified by happiness, of course. Next up, the Banosoi give base tax, quite a bit of base tax. They give ship recruit speed locally. They also give a base resource production, and every time that goes above one, that goes up by one whole number, that's another base resource. And they give a flat population output as well. Not listed here is that they give a negative to Splendor, but the reason it's not listed is that the negative amount they give to Splendor is based on the number of Banosoi, not based on their happiness, because otherwise a happier Banosoi population would give scaled up more Splendor reduction, which wouldn't really make sense or be fair. So they give less Splendor at a flat rate per Banosoi, whatever their happiness is. And then lastly, Dwalos, who have the same Splendor mechanic as the Banosoi, they give base tax, supply limit, increase the local governor's wage, and they also give local monthly food. In terms of the thinking of all of this, all these modifiers, with the Dwalos first, the slaves, keep in mind that in classical Greece, the role of slavery was pretty diverse. You had slaves who worked in fields, but you also had slaves that worked really in every industry, alongside crafters and workers that were paid. You had slaves tending to gardens, you had slaves doing construction. So slaves really were doing everything because this was an era where slavery was really quite open-ended, and there was a lot of different there was an idea that because in this kind of environment, in this period of time, slavery was a condition that was either derived from having been captured in war or in like a battle, or you were kidnapped, or you were born from slaves. But slavery was not really associated with things like race or ethnicity or background necessarily. And so the roles of slaves, because most slaves were captured from war, they came with all of their pre-existing skills, and so there was all sorts of different things that slaves were used for. There were tons of slaves that were super educated, that were used in basically like white-collar professions. It's really hard to kind of envision in the world of the modern day where we have the legacy of like American racial slavery, where the idea of kind of white-collar enslaved people who were doing like math in a college is kind of impossible to really think of in that context. But in the classical world, that's the sort of thing that many slaves were used for. And so basically, in order to really represent this, the things that I have the Dwalos pops giving, base tax and supply limit, represent that these are sort of productive populations, at least under the threat of death. They're being productive. They give increased governor wage, because that could be good or bad. If it's in your capital region, that's more wage for your main character. But otherwise, it does make sense that the slaves would enrich the local governor. And then the local monthly food is just so that it facilitates my broader goal of having your food supply come more from pops and buildings than it does from resources, to make food a more dynamic part of the game. And so that's how the Dwalos work and kind of are justified in terms of their mechanics. The Banosoi, again, represent kind of skilled craftsmen. They're freedmen, right? They're not slaves. But they are, very much kind of the crafters, the guild members of the classical world. So their resources, they produce a lot of base tax. They also produce a population output modifier locally. The base resource production and the ship recruit speed all represent their status in society as craftsmen and skilled laborers. And then, again, the Banosoi and the Dwalos, who are the most efficient tax producers, also produce negative splendor. So they reduce the amount of splendor in a tile. You can see the example here, how the Dwalos and Banosoi are reducing it just by being there, whatever their happiness is. The Metoikos, again, represent populations of foreigners, or those born from foreigners who don't have citizenship, but are of every sort of class. They're not just skilled laborers. And their modifiers are just as diverse. Base tax, a little bit of manpower, research points, commerce value, and migration attraction, because happy Metoikos, keep in mind again that the migration attraction there is scaling up with happiness because it's an output modifier. Happy Metoikos will attract more Metoikos to come live there because they'll see that it's a pretty good place to live. And so Metoikos are very versatile. You can really have a strategy where you encourage a lot of these kinds of populations in order to have just a little bit of everything. And then a bit more specialized, you've got the polites, the citizenry. Unlike in vanilla Imperator Rome, where nobles and citizens are kind of rare and most people are freemen, which is historically accurate to the Roman period, in this period, most people would have been polites and then some would have been adastoi. So I have a bit more polites desired ratio by default that you may have been expecting because of that. And the base tax and local manpower of the polites is great. Obviously, the research points are great. The province commerce modifier means that polites are actually stronger when they're mixed with Metoikos and other things that produce base commerce value, as this modifier is then modifying the commerce value. And they also provide, of course, a little bit of monthly splendor. And then the adastoi produce base tax and a tax modifier, and then similarly to the polites, manpower and research points. And so my thinking here is that depending on your aim to have a commerce economy or tax economy, or even focusing different provinces or different cities on those different approaches, you either want to have a lot of polites and Metoikos to get a lot of commerce, or a lot of adastoi and Banosoi and Dwalos to get a lot of tax. So you kind of want to design your tile around whether you're focusing on adastoi or on polites. And as was the case during the period, because democracies and the Delian League are more oriented around polites, while the Peloponnesian League and monarchies or oligarchies are more focused on the adastoi, those different ideologies will have bonuses for those particular approaches, whether it be a commerce economy or a tax economy. So this can get pretty deep, to be sure. And then, having talked about how all the pops work again, my thinking here is that I want the pop modifiers to be complementary to each other, right? I want the days of vanilla Imperator Rome, where your most min-max cities were basically 100% one kind of pop, which is not how a city has ever worked in the history of the universe. These cities were meant to be run by many different classes of people who all occupy different parts of the social fabric, and I want to have the historical accuracy of the mod not be in conflict with, playing well and min-maxing. I want these things to both work together, and so that's what I'm hoping to achieve with the way that I balanced it. And then, in terms of the buildings, let's talk about the buildings for cities first of all. So one thing I've chosen to do is I'm localizing all of the buildings with a Greek name and then a English name in brackets. So for example, the Prokimaya, which is the port, the Limani, which is the harbor, the Nearan, which is the shipyard, the Stratones, or barracks, the Throrion, or the fortress, the Acropolis, or the upper city, the Gymnasion, or the gymnasium, the Sita Potiki, or the granary, the Agora, or the market, the Eragasterion, or the workshop, the Kiterio, or the foundry, the Parioki, or the district, the Thumele, or the shrine, the Naus, or temple, the Theatron, or theater, and the Bulleteran, or the assembly house. So in terms of what all these buildings are doing, probably the best, I'm going to destroy this port just to show you everything here. The best way to think about this here is that there's sort of two kinds of buildings in this mod for cities. Keep in mind that for settlements, they can only have one building. But for cities, there's basically two kinds of buildings. There are buildings that have 5 possible layers that you can build like 5 copies of in a city, and they cost 100 gold base, and they take a year to build base. And then you've got buildings that cost 500 gold base, and they take 2.5 years to build. And you can only build one of them per city, right? And so, for example, the port, or the Prakimaya, gives extra ship recruit speed, commerce value, province commerce percent, ship starting experience, and migration attraction per layer. So keep in mind, all those bonuses can be increased by ×5 when you've got all 5 of the ports built in one city that can have ports. And this is Bronze Age, so only locations that have got the bird flocks are allowed to have ports as a matter of the code. And so notice, by the way, that the commerce value from each port is comparable to a slightly cheaper resource you could trade in vanilla. I'm going to rebalance all the resources because, of course, I am. But buildings directly giving you commerce value like this is not really part of the vanilla game. And this, again, goes into my thinking, my kind of long-term or kind of big-picture approach, where buildings are meant to be another area of strategic thinking that is just as powerful as POPs when you know what you're doing and you're making these plans. So the Prakimaya provides these modifiers. Then you've got these 2 kind of more advanced versions of the port that do different things. You've got the harbor and the shipyard. They both require there to be a port already in order to be built. And of course, the ports need to be in a location that can build them. So you can see over here, a port couldn't be built in Kleonai, for example. And of course, with no port, the harbor or shipyard could not be built either. But anyways, the harbor can only be built at 1 level. It sort of is a strong version of the economic side of the port, so it provides 1 full commerce value by itself, and 25% province commerce by itself. And freeman or Metokos output by 25% to represent that a lot of foreigners are going to be coming to a harbor. You know, it just adds up, and they're going to be doing trade there. So this is a very valuable building to build, but again, it's going to cost 500 gold. It's going to be very, very expensive and money and time. And then the shipyard is focused on boosting up the military side of the port. This provides an additional 50% ship recruit speed, 0.50 ship starting experience. I may rebalance those to be a bit larger. And then 25% tribesmen or kind of craftsman output. Keep in mind that this is synchronous because the craftsmen also provide ship recruit speed from their output, so you know it all adds together here. So you can really get these port cities that you want to build a lot of ships from. You can build a Neorion there and have the full. Once you have a level 5 port and a shipyard, you're going to have a 100% ship recruit speed bonus and a 1% currently ship starting experience. I may increase that a bit actually. Maybe I'll make it a 10% total and something. I need to look at how ship starting experience is actually balanced in terms of how that works. So anyways, that is the idea with the shipyard. Next up, we've got the 5 layers of the barracks, each layer giving plus 0.05 territory provincial loyalty, 5% local fort defense, and 5% cohort starting experience. These are great to build in cities that you recently conquered, and it makes sense that one thing that you would do as the new conqueror of a city is to build barracks to host troops to increase the provincial loyalty, and then they increase the defensiveness of the city, which is certainly a nice bonus as well. And then we've got the Florian, which is the fortress, 1 extra fort level from this, 25% fort defense as well, and 50% garrison growth, only 1 per city. And keep in mind that the city again has 1 fort level by default, so this turns it into a level 2 fort just from that. Next up is the Acropolis, or the upper city, which is 1 more fort level, 5% local splendor, and plus 0.05% monthly splendor. There's very, very few ways to get more splendor cap in this mod. The main idea that I have is that finishing missions actually gives you more splendor cap as a really, really rare reward, or some really strong events or decisions could do it too. So building an Acropolis is one of the few ways to get a splendor cap in a way that you directly control, but again, it's an expensive building. Next up is the Gymnasion, which gives 50% more local manpower, another 50% garrison growth. This can stack, of course, with the 50% from the fortress, and 25% cohort starting experience. You can get a lot of extra manpower by building that gym and letting the boys exercise in the gym. Next up is the Granary for 10% local pop growth, per level. Again, it's 5 levels of these. 5 monthly food from the granary. So again, these buildings are available to you as an alternative to getting food from resources. And again, keep in mind that slaves also produce food. And 500 food capacity per granary as well. And then down here, we've got the Agora, the market, 1 base trade route per market, also 5% to all of your trade routes from there, and also more sort of foreigner output as well, which does make sense. And you can have up to 5 of these. So again, getting those trade routes from the market buildings is going to be really handy. And since trade routes are a province level mechanic, each city in a province is able to build up to 5 up to or including 5 agoras, so you can have a lot of trade routes from infrastructure, basically. Next up is the workshop, 1 base resource production per workshop. So building workshops is actually going to be very, very valuable in cities that have got a valuable resource. Extra pop output of 10% per level, and 5% craftsman output per level as well. Very, very strong building in the way the meta would work here. Then we've got the foundry, plus 0.2 base tax and 5% local tax and 5% local slave output per level of foundry. Then we've got the district. This is 10% pop growth, 5 pop capacity, and 5% pop capacity. You can have up to 5 of these. This basically just allows you to help grow the sort of possible size of the city, which I think makes sense for what the idea of the district would be. Next up is the Shrine, which is 5% integrated culture happiness, and then something you may not really know what to make of, 5% pop realignment speed, I'll talk about that more in a moment, and 5% pop assimilation speed. So the realignment speed is just my edit to the localization of conversion speed, because remember, in this mod, there is no religion. All of the religions and every pop's religious identity in the mod is a ideological alignment with Delian, Peloponnesian, or unaligned. So the religion conversion mechanics have been changed to the realignment mechanics, basically. So realignment, it works the same way as religious conversion. It basically is the religious conversion mechanic, just give it a new appearance. So that is the idea with that. You can have up to 5 of these, and building shrines in unhappy, newly conquered cities to assimilate and align them faster is going to be quite handy. But of course, keep in mind that this does not give you base realignment or base assimilation. It just boosts it up a little bit. But the integrated culture happiness for those that are already there is going to be quite nice as well. Those of your people that are already there. Next up is the 1 per city Nous, the temple, plus 0.25 local provincial loyalty, 25% integrated culture happiness, and 10% local population happiness. Pretty solid stuff indeed, particularly for cities where you've got the money to build a temple and you want to get as much happiness and loyalty as possible from your own people. Then we've got the Theatron for base 2.50 pop assimilation speed and a 25% local boost to pop assimilation speed as well as 10% local polites happiness. So Theatrons are great for assimilating people's culture. It makes sense that a theater would play a role in that. Just as how with the other one here, the assembly house, we've got that same exact set of modifiers except for realignment and the Ada story. So an assembly house helps to realign everyone to be what the ideology of the state is and the local nobles like it, while the theater helps to assimilate everyone to what the local or what the state culture is and the citizens like it. So I think this makes a lot of sense. And those are the city buildings, but I'm not done. We've still got the settlement buildings, which I've also done a pass over here. Now, something that I've gone for with the settlements is that they actually have the same city port and shrines available to them, because I think that these buildings actually, even with just 1 copy, because you can only build 1 of the 5 available, because you only have 1 slot for a settlement, even with 1 copy, these can still be, I think, solid options for a settlement. The shrine in particular could be great for getting some assimilation or realignment in a settlement tile, just a bonus for that. And the integrated culture happiness is also nice. Of course, ports have a lot of strategic value as well. But we also have the Orikyo, or the mine, for base tax, local tax, percent, and slave output. The Xylefsi, or the lumber yard, for base tax, local monthly food, and slave output. Or the Agroctima, the farm, for local population growth of 10%, monthly food and slave output. You can notice, by the way, the big focus on slave output because, again, settlements are going to have a larger slave desired ratio compared to cities. And then lastly, we've got a pretty interesting one, the Kome, or the village. This basically, you may look at these modifiers and be a little bewildered what's going on here. If you actually do the math, what these desired ratio changes are doing is it turns the desired ratio of the settlement into the city desired ratio. So the settlement desired ratios, 0% nobles, 10% citizens, 5% freemen, 55 slaves, and 30 tribesmen. If you count what this is doing, right, the slaves goes from 55 to 20, the tribesmen goes from 30 to 10. If we go and look at a city, for example, those are the, hold on, wait, I did the math wrong. 100%. Okay, I'll adjust it later, but the idea, at least with the village, is that it basically changes all the desired ratios of a settlement to be the same as a city. And now, of course, it takes up the one building slot, so again, just ignore that I got the math wrong before I'll adjust it. But the idea with the village is that if you just want to have a settlement act like a little city and have, the same basic structure that a city would have, which is honestly not a terrible idea with the number of polites and Arastoi that are going to be in this game. Having them live out in the countryside is not that bad, honestly. And because every kind of pop gives more things, right? Many kinds of pops give the same kinds of resources. Building villages is actually not the worst idea if you have no better thing to use for that tile. And something I've removed from the game, from the mod, are the resource-specific buildings. So there's no longer, like as you can tell, you can build a mine anywhere, whatever kind of resource there is. Same thing with the farm. Because again, the focus I want to have here is on, having more strategic options for buildings and for how pops are organized. As in the base game, it feels like you're often reacting to the layout of the land and where resources are to do all your planning, which isn't unrealistic, but from a strategy point of view, I think it's much more interesting to give you, the player, much more control over what you choose to build as you specialize every tile of every province for your strategy, for your grand strategy. And part of that, it plays into, again, the big picture idea of all of the different systems at play in the hegemony balance are all meant to be in concert together, right? It is a choir of balance that is all working in unison, not a solo act by, just the population system with all of the other systems, acting in support. I want the pop system, the building system, all the other different systems to all coexist on the same level and be complementary to each other. And so there is still strategy around planning your buildings around what pops you have, but there's also strategy around building buildings and then trying to move pops around, given that you may have noticed there is no pop desired ratio modifiers on any of these buildings except for the one example of the village. And there will be some ways to get pop desired ratio temporarily through things like, I think I'm probably going to have the governor policies be the main thing for that. I haven't redesigned those yet, but I think that in the base game, the over-focus with the buildings on pop desired ratio really just led to the idea that the buildings are there as a modifier for the pop system, not as their own standalone kind of autarkic system that has its own value and strategy for it that is unrelated to pops or is not just dependent on the pop system. And so getting desired ratio from other sources is still going to be there, but the buildings are there for their own bonuses on top of their effects on the pops, obviously. And the one thing I wish was that in this game there was a local build cost modifier, which there's not in the code as far as I can tell, because I would have added that to the pops to have even more interactive dynamics between the different systems. But having said all that, that basically wraps up this developer diary. A lot of information to share with you, even beyond the big announcement, of course, of the video, which was that alpha release date, August 1st, 2024. I'm super, super excited to see how that release and that alpha release goes. Very, very excited to get everybody's feedback and really excited to see people finally get the chance to play this mod for themselves and see how it feels to them. I'm really looking for that feedback on how these balance changes feels to play. I can kind of theory craft as much as I like, and I've done a lot of that, but ultimately this is a video game. It's not just something on paper. This is meant to be played, and it's meant to be played by very, very smart people who are going to completely try to min-max this. And my goal here is to create a system that rewards min-maxers who want to still feel like they're playing a game that has some level of sort of role-play realism, right? So as opposed to the vanilla game or some of those other mods, those big mods that don't change the population at all, where the meta really is to have, giant slave cities, where there's gold tiles, or having, crazy, like 50% noble ratio, which is completely absurd. Like this would have never happened in the real history, but that's the way that the base game works because of its over focus on the population system. Everything goes back to the way the pops are organized. And so by trying to decentralize the core mechanics from pops to be pops, buildings, and all these other things all, kept in account, I want you to be able to min-max with an eye towards balancing a bunch of different systems, not just balancing a bunch of systems around one system. So that's a lot of things to have said, that's a lot of information to have shared, but I am really, really happy with how this mod is coming along, and I'm really excited to see what you all think when it gets released in its alpha state on August 1st. But until then, there will be more updates coming. Please continue to check the Hegemony Discord, link in the description, for regular updates. And more developer diaries will be coming in the near future as well. You can be rest assured of that. So having said all that, thank you all so much for watching this developer diary, and I'll see you all next time.